Good morning. In some senses around tax reform, when you start to talk about tax reform and you start to talk about the federal system, we've been here for the last 30 or so years. And I suppose my question is, are we at a different point, or are we going to get caught in the previous discussions about tax reform and the Federation, where we either introduced things but didn't implement them, where we either discussed things but never did anything, or where we did something like the GST but the states didn't actually follow through on their commitments? So are we just doomed to repeat that? And I think to answer that question we need to actually better understand where we are at the moment in the fiscal cycle and the Commonwealth and the states, because the bargaining position that states and the Commonwealth and other stakeholders are going to start from is fundamentally determined by our fiscal position at the moment. So what I want to share with you is, this is my Clive Palmer moment, what I want to share with you is a series of charts. But rather than just looking at the forward estimates and rather than just looking now and in the recent history, I want to go out to 2050. Because if we're talking about tax reform, we're not talking about something here and now, we're talking about doing it for a while. If we're talking about changing the Federation, that's not a here and now, that's decades of change. This chart shows you the federal government balance sheet effectively at the last MyEFO. It takes as a given that the forward estimates are true, whether you believe them or not, we take them as a given. The modelling is built off the Commonwealth's IGR framework, so we've discussed it before. Population, productivity and participation are the key drivers. It then builds into it household consumption patterns. It builds into it spending patterns by governments as well. And what it shows you is you can't fight demographics. If we do not change the way that our households spend and live now, if we don't change the way that government is forecast to continue its spending, there is an inexorable budget budget deficit will grow over time. That's the demographics. The interesting bit is the last budget, just a short time ago, if all implemented, looks like it actually solves the problem. Now, I suspect that most people don't believe that all the budget is actually going to be implemented. And the interesting point that I find here is about half of the gain that is made in the long term is driven by two policy changes. Fuel indexation. Now, whether you believe we'll have fuel in 2050, I'll leave that up to your technology forecasting, but let's assume that we have some tax on energy of a similar nature. And pushing out the retirement age is the other one that takes about 1% of GDP equivalent. Long-term demographics. You can't fight it, you have to harness it. So the Commonwealth has broadly, and assuming there's no changes, broadly repaired its balance sheet. Quite a change to 6 months ago. The consequence, obviously, has been to reduce the net debt that we were forecasting to go forward. So Clive Palmer was quite correct yesterday. Australia does not have a government net debt problem. But the trend is a problem, and I think we need to view it in that sense. So it's not that we're not at Greece at the moment. If we kept going on the trajectory that we were forecast to go on, we would have ended up like Greece in 2050. That assumes we would not have made any changes. So I think understanding the movement of the trend is the important point here. If we fix the budget deficits, we also fix the debt problem. So the chart here, the yellow, shows that effectively, the net debt problem from government is solved by the last budget, if all implemented. The real challenge here is we've just shifted the burden to the states and the territories. So this was the budget position of all the state and territory governments in Australia. A bit up, bit down, but again, the demographics, ageing population, increasing demand for aged care, increasing demand for health, pushes the states into deficit over the long run, unless something is actually done. The real challenge is the budget at the Commonwealth level transferred costs effectively to the states, made their budget position even worse. With a consequence, therefore, for state and territory debt. So state governments have not traditionally had large debt problems over the estimates that are provided there. But clearly the debt problem becomes much more significant after the last federal government budget. So the states are put in a somewhat precarious position. And in fact, Australian state governments are relatively exposed to government debt. Now, this is not absolute numbers, so I'm not suggesting again that state governments are in a terrible fiscal position. Can you see that yet? So Australia, though, state governments have the largest proportion of all government debt of the major OECD countries, and other countries if you look at that. So relatively exposed to debt, but in fact they also don't have the capacity to service it in the same way. And so John made the point before about, the phrase has dropped out, but vertical fiscal imbalance is one of the fundamental challenges that the governments have. So this table shows that for 24 advanced economies, the central government or the federal government raises 82% of all taxes and spends 72% of all expenditure of governments. Not terribly out of alignment. You look at Australia, the federal government raises 74% of taxes but just over 50% of the expenditure, and in fact employs the expenditure on employment of staff is only about a quarter. So in other words, the states, and to a lesser extent local government, disproportionately employ people and spend money. They're providing the services, so it's understandable. But what it means is the states have, and as John pointed out, the exposure to that risk of being expected to deliver things but not having the capacity to raise funds to deliver them. This is one of the fundamental challenges that our federation experiences. I'd like to say most economists would think that the central element of a tax reform would be a tax mix switch. Now, that might be too optimistic, but I'll assert that for the moment. The central point of any tax reform that I believe we need to go through is to really seek to lower corporate and personal taxes and switch that burden to land and consumption taxes. The reason for that at its core is a productivity argument. We want to switch from less efficient taxes, taxes that cost more to raise, to more efficient taxes. That reduces the burden on the population, provides the right incentives, encourages or discourages the incentive to seek to avoid taxes by international means or any other means. The real challenge for that, and I've heard a Premier say this, the Premier said, I agree that this is the direction we need to go. But as a state Premier, how can I go to an election that says, I am going to increase your taxes on your house? It may be the right thing in part of a grand bargain, but the political challenge of this switch is a significant one. We all point to the ACT as the state or the territory that's done this. But in fact, the ACT has done it over a 20-year span. So the political cost of this reform in the ACT has been diluted by spreading it out over decades. At the same time, it actually dilutes the benefits as well. So getting that timing is quite the challenge. And so I do want to touch on some of the challenges. I believe that one of the major challenges is that all cards need to be on the table. We need to pause in this culture of opposition. Interestingly, the culture of opposition comes from every stakeholder in the tax reform debate or the federalism debate, whether it be oppositions saying that some things will never be included, whether it be governments ruling out recommendations for tax reform from the Productivity Commission before a report is even handed down. There needs to be an openness to the debate. If things are ruled in or out of the debate prematurely, it limits the options for a proper reform package to be developed. Ultimately, tax reform needs to be about the sustainability of revenue, collected in the most efficient manner. But even within that, even if you're adopting the principles that Andrew reflected before about simplicity and efficiency and equity, the way that you think about tax reform can have a whole lot of subtext underneath it. Is it about the speed of fixing the deficit? Is that the political imperative? You could see that at the federal level at the moment by increasing the personal income tax by 2%. That was seen as the imperative rather than sustained tax reform. Should the priority be about encouraging growth? Does that affect the sequencing of your reforms? Or in fact, should it be about let's change the federation and tax is almost just part of that narrative? I don't think there's a right or wrong answer here, but I think these are different strands that lead people down different reform paths. If we're going to have everything on the table, I now want to back away from that and say, let's be pragmatic. I get concerned when we talk about federal state reforms or when we talk about tax reform and every amazing theoretical idea gets put on the table. It probably doesn't lead us anywhere. We are a nation of pragmatic reform. We think the GST was this amazing thing that was highly novel. It wasn't. No. And I think if we're going to do major tax reform equally, let's be incremental. Let's not try and reinvent the wheel. If we try and reinvent the wheel, it will spook the horses. I'm mixing every metaphor I can think of here, which is not inappropriate for tax reform. So pragmatism rather than innovation, I think, is actually the path that we need to think about. And I would hope that you as representatives of corporates and government and other stakeholders will think about what we can actually achieve, not some theoretical ideal. And in that context, I think the other key element is the notion of the grand bargain. Everyone needs to be seen to be both a winner and a loser of tax reform. There needs to be that concept of we are all investing in achieving a better national outcome. And this is why piecemeal reform, I don't think, is sustainable. And I think the same principle applies to piecemeal reform from a Commonwealth state perspective. It can get picked off if there are defined winners or defined losers, and there isn't a trade-off of winning and losing. Putting everything together in a big package actually has that benefit of making it harder to unpick. The real challenge from the fiscal perspective is, do we have the funds to pay off some of those stakeholders who have maybe traditionally seen tax reform as a way of being overcompensated to cover the risk of change? We've done it with carbon pricing, we did it with the GST. You look at the finances, we aren't actually in a position to say we've got billions of dollars of surpluses to buy stakeholders off or to overcompensate stakeholders. It's a fragile position. It's actually an awkward position to start a tax reform process. That doesn't mean we should put it off. The last point, and maybe this is something for discussion, is how do you actually hold governments to their promises? And I think that, to me, is one of the key challenges when you start a tax reform process in a Commonwealth state environment. How do you hold governments, future governments that aren't in power yet, to the principles that you will ultimately all have to agree? And I think that, to me, is one of the challenges which the federal system will need to address one way or the other, whether it be through, well, it won't be through the Code Reform Council, but what the mechanism for that ultimately still needs to be determined. I'd like to think tax reform is important now because of changes at the globe that Andrew Lee talked about. I'd like to think it's important because of our ageing population. I'd like to think it's important because we're coming out of a mining construction boom. I don't think it is important for those things. I think it is important because we are at that juxtaposition of each of those. Individually they are important, but put them all together and I think we are at that point in history where tax reform is a fundamental. Thank you very much.